Hello, my name is Steve Larson. I teach viola at the Hartt School of the University of Hartford. This video is going to be talking today about Rebecca Clarke's Passacaglia, and the end of the video I'm going to be doing an unaccompanied performance of the Passacaglia, so you can actually see what I'm talking about in the context of a whole run-through of the piece. Now I'll say immediately that's unaccompanied. The piece is written to be played with piano, and there are many good recordings and videos available, and so certainly make sure that you listen to many of those recordings many times in addition to the unaccompanied performance that I give at the end. We're giving the unaccompanied performance so that students can hear what the piece should sound like when they're practicing unaccompanied or when they have to do an audition unaccompanied. It's just an additional tool that students can use to help them get prepared. This piece is generally a slow-moving piece. It doesn't have a lot of technical fast notes, a couple sort of grace note-y type things in one bar later in the piece, and a couple bars of chords and double stops. But really, mostly it's slow melodic playing. It's about tone production, tone shaping, tone quality, how you use your vibrato, how you use your bow, and there's a fair bit of shifting within those melodic lines that has to be done very beautifully without bumps. A little bit of sliding is okay, but it can't be schmeary and has to all be in good taste. So let's talk a little bit about the pace of the piece to start. The piece is written in time signature 4/4, although it occasionally changes to other time signatures 2/2 in a few bars, but mostly it's in 4/4. It's the tempo indication that Rebecca Clarke gave us was grave, ma non troppo lento, which means very slow, but not too slow, which is a little contradictory. And so you'll hear recordings at a variety of tempos, but most of the convincing recordings that I've heard, I kind of agree with my own opinions about the tempo, which is somewhere in the range of quarter note equals 63 up to about 69. And the piece isn't completely static. It does move forward and back a little bit, but it generally stays within that range. And a very nice way of thinking about the piece to get it to flow well is to not think of it so much as being in 4/4, but actually think of it as being in 2/2, even though that's really slow. So that instead of thinking of ba, ba, da, dum at the beginning, you might think ba, ba, da, dum, bum, which means that those all four quarter notes are still there. You notice I was tapping very lightly on the second and fourth beats with my fingers, but I'm not giving every quarter note a heavy emphasis. And that will help the slow pace of the piece not feel too static or too heavy when it's not supposed to be. Rebecca Clarke has given us all sorts of wonderful indications of dynamics, which can be interpreted to give you a good variety of colors. A good instance of that is the very beginning. She marks mezzo forte. She doesn't mark it forte, and you hear some people play this piece, the very opening, they're playing, it sounds like they're playing as loud as they can, and it sounds maybe a little bit bombastic or a little aggressive sounding. And I think Rebecca Clarke was trying to be very clear that she doesn't want that at the very beginning. She wants rich tone and really singing, but not really accented, not really heavy. So there is somewhere to go later. So even within the very first phrase, if you look at measure 5 and 6 or 4 and 5, there's a crescendo diminuendo partway through that first phrase. And if you start the very beginning as loud as you can, then you don't really have anywhere to go very nicely to shape that phrase. And even when there isn't a crescendo or diminuendo marked, most of the time the phrase should be either growing or receding. So the music should be constantly being shaped. And you want to use her indications to give you a good structure to the whole piece and a good variety of colors. So if you look quickly through the whole piece, you'll see that there's the beginning is mezzo forte. In the third line, measure 11, there's a mezzo piano. So she brings the dynamic down a little bit from the very beginning. And then down even further, she goes down to pianissimo in measure 22. And at that point, you can get quite extreme. And you'll notice when you hear my run-through later that I play that passage and some of the passages later that are marked triple piano. I play those with very little vibrato. I'm over the fingerboard with my bow. I'm creating a very distant, pale, haunting, that's my attempt anyway, a haunting color. Something that's very, very special. It's not just plain playing. So, and then she's brought the dynamic down to that extreme level in measure 22. And then fairly quickly after that measure, in measure 25, there's a big crescendo that leads into the first forte of the whole piece, which is in measure 26 in the middle of the bar as you play the 3-note chords. And then a few bars after that, it finally builds to a true fortissimo where you're giving it everything you've got. But hopefully within the context of this piece, you don't want to be forcing your sound. You want to sound very passionate and very outgoing, but not forced. So you have to keep in mind your technique as you get into the forte and the fortissimo, that your bow hand stays well shaped, that your joints don't lock up, that you've got good shock absorbers in your arm and in your body as a whole, and you can play your fortes and fortissimos gorgeously, powerfully for the fortissimo, of course, but not forced. It still has to be very singing. And then if you look at the next page, it's got some similarities also to what was on the first page. By measure 41, she's brought us back down to piano espressivo. Piano espressivo, one way of interpreting that is kind of mezzo piano with a very expressive vibrato. So it's not that different from, say, the third line at the beginning, measure 11, measure 41, somewhere in the same ballpark in terms of dynamics and level of expression. And then again at 45, she brings us down to pianissimo, and then even further down at measure 53, it's all the way down to triple piano. And then again, she keeps it there for a few bars, and you'll notice in the run-through I use a very, very pale sound. I shape within that triple pianissimo dynamic, but I'm not shaping up to a mezzo forte or anything like that. I'm keeping it within this very haunting, almost distant wind type color. But then very quickly again, she has a crescendo up to mezzo forte at 60, but then brings it back down to pianissimo, and then finally a very big crescendo into 65, molto crescendo to fortissimo, and then the whole ending is very strong. Again, watch your tone quality in the fortissimos. You do need to be playing loud, but it has to be beautiful and singing and not aggressive or ugly sounding. So she does one last little pullback at measure 78 as in the very closing phrase. The forte at measure 78 is actually an indication to start that last line of the music a little bit softer so that you have somewhere left to grow for the very final climax. She's marked at triple fortissimo, so you really got to give it a lot. But again, watch that technique and watch the tone quality. It shouldn't sound forced. It has to sound grandiose and glorious, and then there's the major chord at the very end where it goes from C minor to C major on the very last chord. That has to sound open and ecstatic and definitely not forced. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about tone production. I've already mentioned things about having your whole body cooperating with flexibility, your stance, that sort of thing. Let's look at the bow hand and think about what your teacher has been trying to teach you for years in terms of bent fingers, bent thumb. You'll see that. Placement of the fingers, very important. Make sure the middle fingers can come far enough over the stick so that when the pinky goes on top, it can be bent easily. You have to think about how you hold your viola. This thing here, which most people call a chin rest, really it's a jaw rest. We don't usually hold like this. We hold with the viola on the shoulder, and it's the jaw that goes on what's called the chin rest. I sometimes refer to it as the jaw rest. And then with your shoulder rest setup, whatever you use, and your chin rest setup, Ideally, you can hold your instrument fairly comfortably without too much force at a fairly level platform. You notice my strings are almost parallel to the ground, and that's how you want to be able to hold your instrument even without your left hand. Now, with your left hand, you support the instrument so you're not constantly having to hold everything with your shoulder and your jaw. And if you don't have a setup that works in this way where it's reasonably comfortable to do this, then you need to experiment with your shoulder rest, experiment with your chin rest, probably try some different chin rests if needed. Talk to your teacher about finding a way to be able to do this, because having this ability to hold the instrument comfortably without the left hand support is really important to be able to have a free vibrato and to be able to do shifting more easily. We still hold partially with the left hand most of the time, but you need that flexibility in terms of how your basic setup is done. When you're working on your playing on individual strings, your upper arm has to be free to move up or down from the shoulder to position the bow at the correct level for each string. And in the Rebecca Clarke Passacaglia, there aren't really any fast string crossings. There's no passages that go back and forth. So you're just when you do a string crossing, you basically cross strings and then you stay on that string for a while usually. And so you get to really do string by string arm level and really find exactly what feels perfect for each string. So for instance, if I play on the G string, carefully setting up my bow hand and how I'm holding my viola, if I play on the G string, you'll see that my bow is almost parallel to the ground, and you'll notice also that my upper arm and my forearm and the back of my hand are all mostly parallel to the ground. And in fact, you could, if I ordered pizza, and if I was busy practicing open G strings, I could just tell the pizza delivery man to sit the pizza box on my bow and my forearm and my upper arm, and it would sit there, and my pizza would not fall on the ground and get schmucked. That is a really great way of thinking about how to be on the right arm level for each string. The G string is ideal for actually accepting a pizza delivery order because you're mostly parallel to the ground. If I go up to the C string, you notice that I'm pointing my bow slightly uphill when I do a down bow. So a down bow on the C string actually goes slightly uphill. But my whole pizza box surface has tipped. My upper arm is pointed slightly uphill, and again my forearm and the back of my hand are mostly parallel to the ground. So again, I have a flat surface defined by my bow and my forearm and my upper arm. If I go to the D string, that whole surface defined by these things is tipped down a little bit, and if I go to the A string, my upper arm comes close to my body, doesn't actually touch. You see from the back, my upper arm isn't actually against my body, but it's pretty close to my body, and that whole playing surface is slanted down, but it's still a flat surface defined by my bow, the back of my hand, my forearm, and my upper arm. So that's bow arm level, basic hand setup, bow arm level, the viola hold, and makes it a lot easier to do the bow arm motions. Now, basic tone production. There are some basic things that you need to be monitoring and adjusting constantly to get good tone production. And one of the most important is where you place your bow on your string, and that's called the point of contact, or the distance from the bridge. If you place the bow far from the bridge, you have to use a lot of bow, and you get a fairly airy sound. If you place the bow closer to the bridge, you have to use more weight, and you have to use a slower bow. And you get a thicker, more focused sound. If you get very close to the bridge, it will get a little aggressive sounding, but more powerful. So You have to be constantly adjusting that depending on what sort of tone you want. So tone quality and tone shaping. Shaping means you're thinking about not just how loud is that note and how loud should the next note be. When you have longer notes, you're actually shaping within the notes a lot of the time. So notes are not just flat surfaces. They have a certain shape to them. There's an attack at the beginning of the note, there's a shape, and then there's a taper or a crescendo into the next note, depending on what shape you want. So you have to be thinking about that shaping. You have to then also be thinking a lot about your vibrato in this piece. And that vibrato has to match the tone quality that you're looking for in general for the passage that you're playing. And then you have to be shaping that vibrato. So the vibrato helps to connect notes. It helps to build excitement in a phrase. It helps to release tension. So these are all different things you have to be kind of working on. A good way of working on your vibrato is to look at your left hand positioning. Now this is something that you'll see in a little more detail when I do the run through for you. But you want to have your fingers able to touch the string without straining the hand too much, which means you have to position your upper arm to get things in the right position. And then you may need to adjust that a little bit to be able to vibrate each finger. So if I want to do a really good fourth finger vibrato, it's not quite the same hand position as I use for a first finger vibrato. So that's where I put my hand for first finger. And I can see the palm of my hand right now for my first finger vibrato. If I walk up through to my fourth finger, now I had to bring my hand forward towards me, and I've turned my hand a little bit to be able to vibrate my fourth finger like that. So that's something you're going to need to work on in the course of working on this piece, is exactly how your left hand is set up to play the piece and play all these lyrical things. You're not going to have to play very many fast notes or fast scales, so you don't have to have your hand perfectly positioned to play notes fast one after the other. You can actually move your hand between notes a little bit to get maximum comfort for your vibrato. It's a little bit different left hand usage than it would be for playing a fast scale passage. So that's something that you want to explore. Of course, you should be practicing your scales and practicing fast things where you do use a more stable hand position, but when you're playing a slow lyrical piece, you can be a little more flexible note by note and still be able to play in tune. So then we have to talk a little bit about fingering choices and a little bit about shifting. So she's given us a little bit of information. Rebecca Clarke, if you don't know already, Rebecca Clarke was one of the great violists of the early 20th century. She was famous both as a viola soloist, and she was in a really well-known string quartet. And so the indications in here that are specifically related to how to play the notes are Rebecca Clarke's in all likelihood. And we should probably take them fairly seriously since she was a very fine violist. So the first thing you're going to see as far as fingering indications isn't so much a fingering as a general indication. In measure 4, you're going to see a Roman numeral 4 over top of the first note in measure 4. And that Roman numeral 4 refers to which string you should play the next few notes on. And so Roman numeral 4 refers to your C string. So if it was a Roman numeral 1, it would be your A string. If it was a Roman numeral 3, it would be your G string. So, so for that fourth measure, that's telling you to play at least start on the C string. But my understanding of it is that she actually wanted the whole 2 bars on the C string. So I start in 4th position there, and I go up to 6th position. And then I come down. And not everyone does that. You'll see videos and hear recordings of a lot of great players who decide that that's maybe not the best sound for their instrument. And so if you don't like what your instrument sounds like, or if you are really just not comfortable playing in sixth position on the C string, then you might want to try an alternate fingering, but you should probably start on the C string, perhaps in third position. Something like that. If you start on an open G, that can work, but you're not doing what Rebecca Clarke has asked you to do specifically in that case. And the open G string doesn't necessarily, you can't vibrate it, so it doesn't sound quite as good in the context of the rich vibrato that hopefully you're doing in the first couple measures. So I would recommend following those instructions. Another similar thing is measure 11. She's given us a Roman numeral 2 over top of the C that starts. So, and again, I think that applies to the whole line. So I think you should start in fifth position. Then coming down to third position. And then the next bar has an actual fingering of third finger on E flat, and that's not to indicate second position. And the reason I know that is because of the fingerings in the next bar. She's got a set of fingerings that imply that you're supposed to start up in sixth position, then replace, and replace second finger with the third finger again. So those three pairs of notes are supposed to be played sixth position, fifth position, fourth position. And she has something very similar a couple bars later when it starts on D flat, the pickup to measure 19. So it's a good idea to follow those particular instructions because they are actually rather lovely fingerings. I took that idea of replacement fingerings, and I do that at the beginning, starting in first position, and I replace to second position with my second finger, and I do it again here on the C string, second position, third finger, and then second finger, third position. And that gives a certain type of enunciation between the notes. It's a little bit of a finicky detail. If you find that too bothersome to do, or if you can't get it to happen smoothly, if you can't get it to be in tune, a simpler fingering would be just to start in first position, use your fourth finger. You could do that, but you got to make sure your fourth finger vibrato is good. Perhaps a better compromise is second position, starting on with the open C for the grace note and second finger for the C. And just stay in second position. So when you watch the video of my run through at the end of this, you'll notice that I use some pretty fancy fingerings in a few spots. And I encourage you to try them or explore other possibly fancy options that are really intended to get specific tone colors and specific enunciations, avoid certain slides that might not be in good taste, that sort of thing. But you have to also be flexible, and your hand isn't the same as mine, and you're not necessarily going to be absolutely as comfortable doing my fingerings as I am. And you also have to take into account that you have to pick fingerings that you can play consistently in tune. So if some of the fingerings that I've chosen are a little too complicated for you to want to try in an audition, then that's totally understandable. You pick fingerings in the end, in consultation with your teacher, of course. You pick fingerings that are going to be right for you and that sound right. With your current technical abilities and with your own tastes, because some of the fingerings that I've chosen, it's just a question of taste why I'm doing them. So So let's talk a little bit about shifting. Let's use even in measure 4 with that first example where I play up on the C string, which is I think what Rebecca Clarke wanted. So you have to start in 4th position. Now immediately, as soon as you come to 4th position, you run into the body of the instrument with your hand. So you have to make sure you come around the instrument a little bit, even to start in 4th position. So you can see that the base of my hand is up here on my ribs. I'm not playing in 4th position like this. I could kind of survive that for a couple notes, but I wouldn't be able to use my 4th finger. My 3rd finger would be awfully uncomfortable, and I'd have a huge distance to cover to get up to 6th position. So you want to make sure you're starting in 4th position already around the instrument a little bit. That means my thumb has come under the neck a little bit. And when I shift up to 6th position, you're going to notice this is going to come around the instrument quite a bit more. My fingers are going to look like they're getting quite tall. That's so I can reach my 3rd finger up on that D at the top of the phrase with good comfort. And you're going to notice my thumb is almost all the way out. It's still under the neck a little bit, but I've come around that much so that I can be have strength to be accurate and articulate and flexible to be able to vibrate. Okay? So the other thing in terms of shifting that you have to worry about is the specific distances and how to practice them. So again, taking that example, I have to notice that the shift melodic distance between the note just before the shift, that's an A. The next note after the shift is a B flat, which I could play with my 3rd finger. And that's a great way to teach yourself what the shift is supposed to sound like, is actually play it with an easier fingering. And you could even, if you wanted to, play it in 1st position. So that's the pitches that you're looking for. And now you do it up in position. Play it with 3rd finger. Go back to 2. Then try the shift. Get that 1st finger to where you just were putting your 3rd finger a few seconds ago. The other distance that you want to know is how far does your 1st finger need to move from the 1st note it's playing, which is a G. It's got to go a whole step and then a half step, so it's got to go a step and a half or a minor 3rd overall. So I played a little scale with my 1st finger. And you may have noticed I did an arm motion with each of those steps of the scale, bringing my arm around a little bit. And you can see that this way. And then you can practice that overall distance. And at first, when you're doing that larger motion, the being careful to do the actual arm motion correctly and try to be reasonably loose with your body that's more important than actually getting the pitch completely accurate or the tone quality completely accurate. You want looseness and overall body motion as the top priority. And then you can refine the detail by doing the shift more slowly. So you can actually hear where you're going and slow the finger down just as you're about to arrive at the pitch. Something else I'm doing as I'm practicing that is I'm releasing a lot of pressure. I'm making sure to start by not squeezing the neck or the fingerboard in general, but then I also release a lot of pressure. I'll show you from this angle. You'll see the string comes up as I'm about to shift. And I'm holding the instrument up with my left hand, but while I'm shifting, I let go a fair bit, so I'm not really having to hold the instrument up very much with my left hand. And I'm holding, for larger shifts especially, I'm holding a little bit more with my shoulder and jaw, just to keep the instrument stable and to allow my left hand to be freer. So there's shifting all over the place in this piece, and you're going to want to go through each of these shifts as kind of a mental exercise to make sure you understand what position you're starting in, what position you're going to, what's the melodic distance between the note before the shift and the note after the shift. You'll notice in my own fingering choices that a lot of the time I'm shifting on the half step. So for instance, on the way down that little passage, I come down with one big shift to third position, and then because I have to go all the way down to an E flat at the bottom, I actually do a 3-3 after that. And that breaks a rule because I put a shift and then immediately another shift, but it was the most convenient way to not have a bump in the phrase. So the reason I do the 3-3 instead of a 2-2 is that the 3-3 is an A flat to a G, which is a very small distance. It's a half step. And I use that a lot. A good example is if you look at measure 41 at the top of the second page. So that's two half-step shifts that I did. I started on E flat with fourth finger, half-step shift to another 4, and on the way down, that's all whole steps. But then A flat to a G is a half step, so it's a very convenient way to do a clean shift without it being bumpy. So the other aspect of this piece that I guess we have to talk about is the chords and the double stops. As I said, there's not too many of them, fortunately, but there are some, and we have to talk about how to work on those. So let's talk first about mapping double stops. Most of the double stops in this piece are either sixths or fifths. So by sixth, I mean if you look at the very first chord at the end of measure 26, you'll see that it's a low E flat, an open G string, and a first finger E flat. The distance between the open G and the first finger E flat is a sixth. Okay. The distance between the low E flat and the G is a major third. All right. But there are other sixths in this passage. If you look at the first chord in measure 27, there's the D, first finger D to second finger B flat. That's a minor sixth. So the spacing on the fingerboard, it's important to understand that that spacing is a half step. So even though the interval is called a minor sixth, it's actually straight across from one string to the next plus one half step. And it's really important when you're working on sixths to identify whether the spacing between the fingers is supposed to be a half step or a whole step. This would be a B natural. This is a B flat. So D to B flat, it's the same as same spacing as if you were playing A natural to B flat or D natural to E flat. It's a half step. Okay. Playing fifths and sixths, you actually get to be a little laid back with your left hand because your hand plays sixths and fifths better if the fingers are a little bit lower than sometimes. Sometimes to play like fast notes in a scale, we talk about having tall fingers, and that's great technique for fast scales or for double stop thirds where you have to cross over like this. Double stop thirds, you need really tall fingers. For sixths and fifths, you actually get to lay your hand back a little bit. So if I play, and then just the top fifth, I've actually flattened out my second finger a tiny bit. It's not as steep as I sometimes use my second finger. For fifths, it's a little bit better to be flatter, like this. so that I'm using the pad of my finger a little bit more, because the pad of my finger is a little wider than the tip of my finger. So I can play the double stop fifth in tune more easily. Like that. And the other note in that, fortunately, is a sixth, and that works pretty well with flatter fingers as well. Now, the chord just before that, on the eighth notes, unfortunately that one doesn't cooperate quite as much, because you have a sixth, but you also have to get that second finger all the way over to the C string. So that one you do have to be fairly tall. So one of the challenges in this passage is getting from a fairly tall hand on the first chords to something that's a little flatter. And in flatter, I mean the hand is a little bit lower, so the fingers can be a little more sloped. So just practicing that maneuver of having a tall hand like this for the first chord, with my arm has come around to help my hand get tall. And now I play this chord, and then I let my arm come down. All right. The next two chords have double stop thirds. And I already mentioned, for double stop thirds, you have to have your arm around more so that your fingers can be taller. So when you shift to third position, you have to have a fairly tall hand so you can play the third finger on the G string without it touching the D string. The other thing is you have to really map those double stops in those chords very carefully. The first double stop with a third in it, in measure 27, the third beat has the open C string, third finger E flat on the G string, and first finger G on the D string. You have to map carefully. We'll start with the first finger. The first finger on the D string is a G. And then if I went straight across to the G string, that first finger would be on a C. I could go a whole step to a D and a half step to an E flat. Now I'm going to move my first finger back, to the G string, so it's back on the G now. I'll play that D and then the E flat. So now I've figured out that the distance between my first finger and my third finger for that chord is actually a step and a half, or a minor third distance between the fingers, even though the actual interval between E flat and G is actually a major third. You have to know the distance on the fingerboard to be able to play it in tune. And the very next chord, when you shift down to first position, you have to shift your first finger all the way down to an E flat, and the third finger's on a C. And again, if I do the same kind of mapping, first finger on E flat, move it straight across temporarily, put it on an A flat, go a whole step to a B flat, and another whole step to a C. Now I'm going to move my first finger back to the D string. I'm playing E flat, playing a B flat, which is a whole step above where my first finger is, and third finger on a C. And now I've identified that for that chord, the distance between my first finger and my third finger is actually 2 whole steps. I'm playing that with the open A. So when you shift from the third position chord, where your fingers are, your first and third finger are a step and a half apart, and you shift down to first position, as you shift down, you've got to be reaching for a bigger spacing for 2 different reasons. Because the actual intervals between your fingers are bigger, it's 2 whole steps between 1 and 3, and when you go farther down the fingerboard to first position or half position even, the intervals actually are bigger than they are in third position. So your spacing when you're in third position, when you shift down, it's not just a little bit bigger, it's way bigger. So you really have to expand your first finger back. So that sort of mapping in all the double stops is essential to be able to play it in tune. And then working, taking pairs of the chords and just working the specific motion that you need to do between pairs of chords or pairs of double stops. I'm not going to go through all of the double stops, measure 64, 65, but do notice that it's basically all double stop sixths except for that one chord in downbeat of measure 65. And it's just essential that you carefully map whether or not those sixths are major sixths or minor sixths, and that tells you whether the fingers have to be a half step apart or a whole step apart. If you do that properly, you have a fighting chance of learning those and playing them in tune. If you're not really clear on whether your fingers are supposed to be a whole step or a half step apart, you're not going to be practicing very efficiently, and you've got fairly little chance of actually being able to play them in tune. Back at measure 26, 27, 28, where there are a bunch of three-note chords, it's important to start thinking about how your bow works for that sort of thing. So I find for three-note chords, I don't play these ones, I don't try and play all three notes at the same time, which is possible. If you're not too close to the bridge and you put a lot of pressure, you can get all three notes, all three strings to speak all at once. But that's a pretty aggressive sound, and it's not really appropriate. So for these chords, you're actually going to roll the chords a little bit, all of them. And that means you're going to be starting with the bow touching the bottom two strings. I'll just do this with open strings. You're going to start with the bow touching the two lower strings, and without using too much bow on the bottom two strings, you're going to roll and keep the middle string and roll till you're touching the middle string and the top string of the chord. And you notice I'm not doing a huge arm motion to do that string crossing. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing that. I'm actually using a lot of finger flexibility. And a great way to practice that is to actually start with the top two strings. So the first few chords in measure 26, 27 use the bottom three strings. So the top two strings of those chords are my two middle strings, G and D. And I find what arm level is comfortable to play those two strings, and I go right to the frog. So my shoulder has to be pretty loose to do that. So again, I find comfort on the middle strings and then go right to the frog. And hopefully my hand is now set up well so that I can just let the bow tip over without really moving my upper arm. I just do that. Now I can play the bottom two strings with just a few inches of bow, and now tip the bow back with my fingers. And continue. So I'll show you at this angle. So I've got that comfort on my middle strings. I go right to the frog. I let the bow tip, just the weight of the bow will do that. Play a few inches of bow, move it back, continue. And so, and that's done without much arm motion. Now when I do it for real, my arm is moving a little bit. So I don't keep my shoulders stiff. I do let my arm move when I'm playing those chords, but it's not a huge arm motion because that's just too much weight being thrown around and it's likely to crash and crunch. So work on your bow arm level a lot in this piece in general to be able to sing really smoothly on one string at a time for most of the piece. That's going to be really valuable. And then when you're doing your chords, you want to start by finding the comfortable arm level for the top two notes of the chord. And then you use hand and wrist flexibility to reach over and grab the low strings. Let the arm move a little bit, but not too much. And then you roll without spending too much bow on the low notes. You want to have enough weight on the low notes that you get great depth of sound without too much bow. And if I play the four-note chord, there's only a couple four-note chords, but I'll play this one here. You may have noticed that I was about here in the bow when I got to the top notes. So that would be, for instance, for the very last chord of the piece, or the chords at measure 27 28 or 31. Those chords. You want to get a lot of sound without too much bow on the low strings so that you have lots of bow left to sing the very top notes. So you're going to hear a run through of me playing the piece unaccompanied. I'm going to stress again, make sure you listen to recordings or watch videos of performances with piano. The piano part is an equal partner in this piece. It's an absolutely glorious, glorious piano part that goes with a glorious viola part. And so you'll really enjoy hearing it with accompaniment. I encourage you to practice hard and enjoy the piece as you work on it.